A low rhythmic thunder rolls across the calm face of the Mediterranean. It is not a storm, but the sound of thousands of drums setting the pace for the oars. On a sweltering summer day in 256 BCE, the sea itself seemed to disappear beneath a floating city of timber and bronze. Nearly 700 ships, stretching from horizon to horizon, converged off the southern coast of Sicily. This was not merely a skirmish, it was a collision of civilizations, involving nearly 300,000 men. On one side stood the masters of the waves, Carthage, who had ruled the oceans for centuries. On the other stood Rome, a nation of farmers who had barely learned to build a ship, yet now dared to challenge the gods of the sea on their own altar. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we witness the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, a naval engagement so massive that, by the sheer number of human lives involved, it remains a contender for the largest naval battle in the entire history of our species. But to understand how Rome, a power built on the solidity of earth and iron, managed to construct this floating apocalypse and sail it into the jaws of the enemy, we must first look at the desperate gamble that forced them to leave the land behind. By 256 BCE, the First Punic War had become a festering wound. For 8 long years, Rome and Carthage had bled each other white across the rugged hills of Sicily. Cities were taken, lost, and retaken. Legions marched until their sandals wore through, yet the war remained a stalemate. The Roman Senate, a body of pragmatic landowners and generals, came to a cold realization they could not win this war. On the beaches of Sicily, to kill the beast, they had to strike at its heart. They had to invade Africa, delay zero-day maps. But to reach Africa meant crossing the open sea, the domain of Carthage. Rome did not just need a fleet. They needed an armada capable of transporting an invasion force of nearly 140,000 men. The entire Italian peninsula was transformed into a machine of war. Ancient forests were felled, stripping the Apennines bare. The air in the shipyards grew heavy with the stinging scent of boiling pitch and wet pine. Day and night, the coast rang with the chaotic symphony of hammers and saws as hundreds of quinqueremes, massive warships with 5 banks of oars, rose from the stocks like wooden leviathans. Delays, it was a feat of industrial engineering. Madness. Rome, a nation with almost no naval tradition, was attempting to outbuild the greatest maritime power on earth. Historical records tell us that Roman rowers were trained on dry land, sitting on wooden benches in the dirt, learning to keep time with the flute player before they ever saw a wave. It was a display of Roman dignitas and stubborn will. Finally, the fleet was ready. The Senate signed the order for invasion. But waiting between them and the African coast was the entire Carthaginian navy, commanded by men who had sailed the Mediterranean before they could walk, and who were determined to drown the Roman upstarts in the deepest trenches of the sea. Delay 0.5s. To the south, the Carthaginian fleet emerged like a storm front on the horizon. They brought nearly 350 warships, manned by sailors who knew the currents of the Mediterranean better than they knew the faces of their own children. Commanding them were Hanno the Great and Hamilcar, admirals who viewed the sea as a chessboard of wind and waves. Their strategy was elegant and lethal. Use superior seamanship to outmaneuver the clumsy Roman vessels, ram them in the vulnerable sides, and send them to the bottom. Delay 0.5. Facing them was a Roman armada of 330 ships carrying a terrifying cargo of nearly 140,000 soldiers and rowers. Leading this floating legion were the 2 consuls of the year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso. They were not sailors, they were generals of the land, and they brought the brutality of the infantry square. To the open water, their ships were heavier, slower, and less agile than the Carthaginian triremes and quinqueremes. But the Romans had a terrifying equalizer bolted to their prows, the corvus. This was a boarding bridge 36 feet long with a heavy iron spike on the underside. It was an ugly, top-heavy device that made the ships unstable in rough weather, but in battle it changed the laws of physics. If a Carthaginian ship came close enough to ram, the Roman captain would drop the corvus. The iron spike would smash through the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together in a death grip. Instantly, a naval battle became a land battle. Roman marines, heavily armored and disciplined, would swarm across the bridge, slaughtering the lightly armed Carthaginian crew. Delays 15s. Below the decks, the reality for the nearly 300,000 men involved was a claustrophobic nightmare. Rowers sat naked and sweating, chained to their benches in tears, engulfed in the stench of unwashed bodies and fear. They could see nothing of the battle above. They only knew that if the hull was breached, the water would rush in and they would be dragged down into the dark, still chained to the wood. As the two massive armadas closed the distance off Cape Ecnomus, the Carthaginians expected the Romans to form a standard defensive line. They prepared to use their speed to flank the heavy Roman bricks. But as the shapes became clearer through the sea mist, the Carthaginian admirals realized the Romans were doing something that defied all naval convention. They were not forming a line. They were arranging their ships into a massive floating wedge. The Roman formation was a masterpiece of naval improvisation, of floating geometry, of death designed to shatter the enemy line on impact. At the very tip of the spear sailed the two hexagonal flagships of the consuls, Regulus and Vulso, side by side. Behind them, the first and second squadrons fanned out in diagonal lines, creating the two heavy arms of a massive wedge. This was not a passive wall, it was a battering ram, mimicking the shape of a migrating flock of birds or a cavalry. Charge aimed straight at the Carthaginian center, 0.5s. But the genius and the danger of the Roman plan lay in what trailed behind. Tucked safely inside the base of this triangle was the third squadron, towing the heavy transports filled with horses and invasion supplies. Finally closing the rear like a shield wall came the fourth squadron, the Triarii of the sea, guarding the vulnerable underbelly of the fleet. It was a formation built for one purpose: to punch through, protect the cargo, and land in Africa. 0.5s. Hamilcar, watching from the deck of his flagship in the Carthaginian center, understood the physics of this wooden machine instantly. He saw that the Roman strength was also their weakness. The wedge was formidable, but it was tethered to the slow, heavy transports. To kill the beast, he had to sever the head from the body. He issued a command that would have been suicide for a lesser navy. As the Roman wedge surged forward, oars, churning the water into white foam, the entire Carthaginian center suddenly stopped rowing. Then, with synchronized precision, they turned their ships and began to row away. It looked like a collapse. It looked like fear. Regulus and Vulso, seeing the enemy give way before the might of Rome, ordered their steersmen to pursue at full speed. The Roman wedge accelerated, breaking its protective formation as the warships sprinted ahead, leaving the slow transports in the rear guard far behind. The gap widened, a mile, then two. Hamilcar watched the Roman wedge isolating itself, drifting further and further into the open water, and finally gave the signal to spring the trap. The Carthaginian center turned their prows back toward the enemy. The Romans had taken the bait. Delay 0.5 shut with terrifying speed. Hamilcar's signal flags went up, and the Carthaginian center, which had been fleeing moments before, executed a maneuver that only the most disciplined navy could attempt. Thousands of oars backed water, halting the momentum of hundreds of tons of wood and men. Then they spun on their axis and surged forward into the teeth of the pursuing Roman wedge. Daily sea beam civil. The sea turned white with foam as the two fleets collided. It was not a battle of elegant lines or formations, but a chaotic brawl. In the open water, the leading Roman ships, driven by the aggressive momentum of the consuls, smashed into the Carthaginian line. But here the Roman gamble paid off in blood. As the faster, lighter Carthaginian triremes tried to flank and ram, the heavy Roman Ecnomus turned to meet them. Daily Zuriping 5. A deafening crash echoed across the water, the sound of the heavy wooden Corvus bridges slamming down onto the decks of the enemy ships. The iron spikes bit deep into the timber, locking the vessels together in a deadly embrace. Instantly, the superior seamanship of the Carthaginians was nullified. Roman marines, hardened veterans of the legions, poured across the gangplanks, their heavy shields and short swords, turning the swaying decks into slaughterhouses. The center of the battle became a confusing mass of locked ships drifting, corpses and burning wreckage. Hamilcar's plan relied on holding the Roman vanguard here, bogging them down in a slow grinding fight while his wings executed the real killing blow. Miles away, the Roman rearguard looked to the horizon and saw their nightmare approaching. While their commanders were locked in combat far to the north, the two massive wings of the Carthaginian fleet, commanded by Hanno and the left flank, admiral, began to sweep inward like the jaws of a great beast. The Roman transports were exposed, slow and terrifyingly vulnerable. The trap had separated the head from the body, and now the body was about to be devoured. Delay, the grand battle of Ecnomus had shattered. What began as a single collision of fleets had now fractured into three separate desperate hells spread across miles of open ocean. The Roman plan was in ruins, their formation was broken, and their commanders were fighting for their lives miles away in the north. Delayed Shap. To the south, Hanno the Great commanding the Carthaginian right wing saw his moment. With the Roman vanguard gone, the rear guard, the Triarii squadron, was exposed. Hanno's swift galleys swept in like wolves on a flock, their rams aiming for the exposed flanks of the Roman heavy ships. The Triarii, the veterans of the fleet, found themselves fighting a defensive action in open water, their oarsmen pulling until their hearts threatened to burst, trying to keep their reinforced prows facing the enemy. But the true crisis was unfolding in the center of the broken formation. The Carthaginian left wing, arguably the most dangerous of the three divisions, drove straight for the Roman transports. These were not warships, they were floating warehouses laden with horses, siege engines, and food towed helplessly by the third squadron. Panic rippled through the Roman line. The captains of the third squadron knew they were seconds away from annihilation. Desperate orders were shouted over the roar of the approaching enemy. Sailors scrambled to the sterns, axes in hand. With the sharp crack of severing rope, the tow lines were cut. The heavy transports drifted free, bobbing helplessly in the swell. Delayed from their burdens, the Roman warships of the third squadron did not flee. In a display of discipline that only Rome could muster, they backed water, retreating toward the Sicilian coast. But they did not break. They formed a defensive line, their prows facing outward like a phalanx of pikes, backed against the shore where the deep-drafted Carthaginian vessels dared not follow. It was a terrifying stalemate. The Roman rear was being hammered, the transports were pinned against the rocks, and the ocean was filling with the debris of a dying fleet. To any observer, it looked like the end of the Roman invasion. The head was severed and the body was being devoured. But Hamilcar, fighting in the distant center, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed his center could hold the Roman consuls for hours. He was wrong. In the chaos of ancient naval warfare, once a fleet breaks formation to pursue a fleeing enemy, it almost never returns. The bloodlust of the chase and the deafening noise of battle usually deafen commanders to the wider, a strategic picture. But at Cape Ecnomus, the Roman consuls, Regulus and Vulso, displayed a discipline that would become the hallmark of their civilization. They did not behave like pirate captains. They behaved like legion commanders. In the north, the brutal efficiency of the Roman boarding tactics had shattered Hamilcar's center far faster than the Carthaginian admiral had anticipated. The Roman heavy quinqueremes, essentially floating fortresses, had ground the lighter Carthaginian vessels into driftwood. Hamilcar's surviving ships turned and fled into the open sea, expecting the Romans to follow and scatter. But the Roman ships stopped. Amidst the wreckage and the screams of the drowning, the signal flags on the consuls' flagships snapped in the wind. Halt, realign, return, delay 0.5s. Crucially, the Mediterranean itself played a decisive role in this moment. The sea remained unnaturally calm, a glassy surface that allowed the heavy Roman ships to execute a complex 180-degree turn without capsizing or colliding. If a storm had risen, the Roman fleet would have remained scattered and their rear guard would have been annihilated. Instead, the stillness of the water allowed the Roman discipline to shine. Vulso took the first squadron and drove hard to the left, aiming straight for the Carthaginian right wing that was currently mauling the Roman triarii. Regulus, with the second squadron and the captured prizes, swung wide to the right, aiming for the Carthaginian left wing that had the Roman transports pinned against the coast. It was a textbook application of what modern military analysts call concentration of force. The Carthaginian flankers were exhausted, their rowers' muscles burning with lactic acid after hours of maneuvering to kill the trapped Roman ships. They were locked in a tunnel-visioned fight, convinced they were butchering a helpless prey. They did not look behind them. Delay, and then the shadow sails fell over them. The Carthaginian captains, their eyes fixed on the transports they were about to sink, suddenly heard the rhythmic thunder of fresh drums approaching. From their unprotected rear, they turned to see the intact squadrons of the consuls bearing down on them like a hammer dropping onto an anvil. The trap they had sprung on the Romans had just reversed. The hunters were now the surrounded prey. Delacing the Mediterranean, which for centuries had been the playground of Carthaginian admirals, now became their prison. The Roman counterattack was not a chaotic brawl, it was a systematic execution. The Carthaginian left wing, trapped against the Sicilian coast by the returning squadrons of the consuls, had nowhere to run. Their lighter, faster ships, designed for open water maneuver, were pinned against the rocky shoreline like insects against a wall. Delay 0.5. Panic Carthaginian captains, discipline, realizing they were surrounded by a wall of Roman timber and iron, drove their ships onto the beaches in a desperate attempt to flee on foot. But for dozens of other vessels, escape was impossible. The Roman Corvus bridges crashed down, again and again locking the retreating enemy in place. The sea off Cape Ecnomus became a grotesque parking lot of entangled warships where the only movement was the brutal close-quarters work of the Roman Marines clearing the decks. The scale of the disaster for Carthage was absolute. When the screaming finally died down and the smoke cleared, the cost of their gamble became clear. The Carthaginians had lost nearly 30 ships to the depths, their hulls shattered by rams. But the true catastrophe lay in what remained floating. 64 Carthaginian warships, entire squadrons of their finest vessels, had been captured intact, along with their crews. Thousands of veteran sailors, men who were the lifeblood of the Carthaginian Empire, were now in Roman chains. Rome, the land power that had dared to challenge the sea, had paid a heavy price as well. 24 of their own ships lay at the bottom of the Mediterranean, but they had not lost a single vessel to capture. The psychological blow was devastating. Carthage had lost its shield. The sea was no longer a barrier. It was a highway. Delay as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over miles of drifting wreckage and bodies, the Roman fleet regrouped. The water near the shore was thick with debris and tinted a dark, rusty red. The path to Africa was wide open. But as Consul Regulus stood on the deck of his victorious flagship, gazing south toward the burning sands of the enemy coast, he was sailing toward more than just a new campaign. He was sailing toward his own tragic and legendary destiny. Delay, Irdom Feps. The victory at Ecnomus was not merely a tactical triumph. It was a geopolitical earthquake that shattered the ancient order of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians, who had viewed the sea as their birthright, had been swept from their own element by a nation of farmers who had barely known how to build a trireme a decade earlier. The immediate consequence was swift and undeniable. The Roman armada, battered but victorious, repaired their hulls and sailed south, landing on the shores of Africa at Aspis. For the first time in history, the war was brought to the very gates of Carthage, and the smoke of burning Roman camps could be smelled from the city walls. But the legacy of Ecnomus stretches far beyond the Punic Wars. It proved a terrifying truth about the Roman Republic, its infinite capacity for adaptation. When faced with a superior enemy in a domain they did not understand, Rome did not negotiate. They simply engineered a new reality. They turned the sea into land with the corvus, and they turned rowers into soldiers through sheer force of will. This battle marked the beginning of the concept of Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Mediterranean was no longer a barrier separating empires. It was becoming a Roman lake. Delay 0.5. As for Marcus Attilius Regulus, architect of this victory, his story was far from over. He stood on the African coast as a conqueror, the man who had tamed the ocean, unaware that he was marching toward a tragic fate that would be retold by Roman schoolboys for 1,000 years. To see how the hero of Ecnomus met his end in the dust of Africa, and how the war turned from triumph to disaster, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us